Hello and welcome everyone to another session in the DataHour series. We are thrilled to be here with you this evening for a session full of action-packed learning. I am Rishabh Kumbhalkar, part of the data science team at Analytics Vidhya, and I'll be the moderator for this session along with my colleagues Ketak Gunjal and Monish Raj. For those who have joined us for the very first time, a brief introduction about the DataHour series. The DataHour is a series of webinars conducted by Analytics Vidhya and led by top industry experts. It is a fun way to understand the concepts of data science from the leading players in the data tech domain. And as the name suggests, it's 1 hour dedicated to data. We are hopeful that these sessions are going to be a great source of enrichment and value adding for our community members. Now, on to our session today, which is about hands-on with data analysis expressions, that is DAX for Power BI. In this DataHour, the speaker will break down the essentials of what you need to know about data analysis expressions, that is DAX, how to learn DAX, and where you can study DAX post the webinar as well. And he will also cover plenty of things, including why is DAX so difficult to learn, calculated columns versus measures, the powerful calculate function, time intelligence DAX, tips, tricks, and resources to learn DAX. I hope you all are excited to attend this DataHour with us. Okay, so now, without wasting much time, on to our speaker. In this session of DataHour, we have Pranav Dar with us. Pranav Dar is a senior consultant and lead instructor in the field of business intelligence. He has more than 11 years of experience handling multiple business intelligence and visualization projects for Fortune 500 companies. He has a passion for the art of data visualization and loves to experiment with different projects. He is the lead instructor for Power BI, Tableau, SQL, Excel, and Alteryx, among the other things. Over to you, Pranav. The virtual stage is all yours.
Thanks, Rishabh. Thanks once again for setting this up and for inviting me and for that lovely introduction. So everybody, hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you guys have joined in today, and welcome to this DataHour session on DAX for Power BI. As Rishabh said, my name is Pranav Dar. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys on what is a Tuesday evening for me. Extremely humid, but it's still a lot of fun here. I can talk about Power BI for hours and hours. So we only have an hour. So what I will do is I will dive straight into the agenda, what we're planning to cover today, and we'll take it forward from there. And for anybody who's just joined us in the last couple of minutes, Rishabh already mentioned this before, but in case you missed it, this is definitely being recorded. It will be available on the Analytics with their YouTube channel in a couple of days, maybe 2-3 days after this session. And you can always view the recording there as well. And trust me, if you want to, learn DAX after this webinar in Power BI, you will need to refer to the recording at least a couple of times to get a sense of how it works, what else you can do with it, and all those things. But I'll just talk about that in just a bit. Everybody, I appreciate you guys telling us where you're from. So I am from Gurgaon. If you haven't heard of it, it's next to Delhi. And I can see a lot of global participation today. I think I saw somebody from Kenya, Malaysia, Indonesia. I love it. I was in Jakarta a couple of years back. I love Indonesia. I love going there once in a while. So I'm very happy to have people from all over the globe here. All right. So before we begin, guys, can you use? I can see you're already very familiar with the chat window. Can you just give me a yes or a no in the chat window? Are you familiar with the difference between calculated columns and measures? Just give me a yes or a no. Okay. Okay, I think it's a very healthy mix between yes and no there. Okay, no worries. Perfect. Thank you for letting me know. And those who answered honestly, I really appreciate that, because at the core of DAX is understanding the difference between calculated columns and measures. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. Just give me a second.
Yeah, Pranav, we also have a poll for that.
Okay, sure.
You can share that. Yeah, sure. I've shared it. You can see the results.
Perfect. Thanks, Rishabh. So everybody just, sorry.
Yeah, please continue.
Yeah. So everybody, I appreciate all of you answering, guys. So I'll just give it 10 more seconds. I've heard of them, but not sure what do these terms mean. All right. Okay, I'll give it 5 more seconds. Perfect. I'll just stop the poll. So I think anybody who can't see the results, so it's a 70-30 split. 70% of our audience says that you've heard of them, or maybe you haven't heard of them, but you're not very familiar with these terms. About 29-30% of you are very familiar with calculated columns and measures. Perfect. So this webinar will have something for both segments, both 70% and 30%, because we will be covering slightly more advanced DAX, and we'll be covering the basics as well first, because without that, going forward and learning anything is not going to make a lot of sense. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me just bring out the chat window. All right, so can you guys see my screen? You should be seeing the Power BI slide right now. Just give me a yes.
Yeah, it's perfectly fine.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so quickly, I think Rishabh already introduced me, so I'm not going to get into any of this. Just want to mention, outside my professional commitments, I am a youth sports fan. I take a lot of free webinars on introduction to sports analytics, especially football and basketball. Not cricket. Cricket is not something I am very familiar with. So if any of you is interested in sports analytics, especially football or basketball, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, or after the webinar, I can talk about sports for a week or a month non-stop. So that's just something that I enjoy outside of my work commitments. All right, so what are we planning to cover in this data? Obviously DAX, right? It's all about DAX today. So first of all, we will talk about what is DAX, why is DAX so difficult to learn, and that is a very interesting question that I haven't seen a lot of people pose. That you know what DAX is, you know how to use DAX at least at a basic level, but why is it so difficult to learn for beginners, even programmers? Even if you know Python, if you know R, you coming from even if you know SQL, you come to learn DAX and suddenly everything changes, everything looks different. It's very difficult to understand what it is. Why does that happen? So I want to answer that question before we get into any of the nitty-gritties of it. Then we'll talk about the important DAX concepts and obviously answer the key question of calculated columns versus measures. What in the world is the difference between them? And then we'll get into Power BI. We'll create a couple of calculated columns, but most of our focus, as you might expect if you've heard of these terms, will be on creating measures. That is at the heart of DAX. That is what you'll be doing most of the time when you're working with Power BI in the industry. So that is what we'll try and cover. And apart from some basic functions and basic formulas, I also want to show you a couple of slightly more advanced, let's say, code in DAX that is very commonly asked by our clients, by our stakeholders. So from a business perspective, that is something you should be aware of how to answer that question in Power BI. So we'll try and answer that as well. So that is the agenda. And just stepping outside of DAX for a second, one thing that I want to impress upon you guys is even if you've not heard of DAX before, that's okay for now. If you ever are interested in learning a tool like Power BI, like Tableau, any of these business intelligence tools, it's important to not just learn the tool, it's important to understand how does that relate, or how am I helping the business using this particular tool. So whenever you're learning something, try and marry business sense, put on your business hats. Even if you don't have experience, there is way too much material out there these days, so there's no lack of resources you can lean on. So try and lean on, or try and apply your understanding of the business with Power BI to try and answer a few business questions. It will help you broadly in two things. One, if you ever plan to sit for interviews or anything of the sort, recruiters, hiring managers, all these folks don't just judge you on your technical skills. Obviously that is required, no doubt about it, but they also try to understand how structured is your thought process, how well can you think from a business perspective. Do you know what a KPI is, right? A key performance indicator. If you don't know that, that's okay for now, but can you relate that KPI, can you relate that metric to something like a dashboard? How do you represent that in a dashboard in Power BI or Tableau? Those are questions you should be able to think about. Otherwise, just learning Power BI is not going to be good enough. So try and combine these two when you're practicing, when you're learning, and that is how you will very quickly get to understand what is the interviewer or what are the industry people looking for from you when it comes to Power BI and Tableau. All right, so coming back to our DAX, we'll start off by understanding what in the world is DAX, right? If you've heard of it, you'll know what it is. If you haven't, let's put a formal definition to it very quickly. So DAX, as Rishabh mentioned, stands for Data Analysis Expressions. It's a programming language that's used throughout Microsoft Power BI. It also exists in Excel. Not a lot of people know that, but DAX is also at the if you've used Power Pivots, DAX is also used in Excel there. But coming to Power BI, it's used for things like creating calculated columns, custom tables, and most important all of these is creating measures. It is a functional language. What does that mean? It means that it is entirely driven by functions. Right? You have to understand how those functions work if you want to understand and master DAX. Coming from a Python or whatever programming language you know background is good, but it will require something of a mindset shift when it comes to learning DAX. So my suggestion is keep all your previous programming experience aside when you're learning DAX. Otherwise, you're going to get into a twist and you're not going to understand any of how DAX works under the hood. It is a little different in terms of how it works, but once you get the hang of it, it's smooth sailing after that point. Like I said, when you're talking about the agenda, I want to answer this question. Why is DAX so difficult to learn? And usually when I tell people, and when I say tell people, this is something I went through myself. When somebody told me why DAX is difficult to learn, you should be prepared for it, I was a little skeptical. That can't be true. I know Python well, I know SQL well. How difficult can DAX be? I'm sure if I can do stuff in Excel, I can do DAX in Power BI. How difficult can it really be? Right, so I was skeptical when I heard this, and I've seen this reaction from a lot of people when they hear DAX is difficult. But when you actually get into DAX, and this is a reaction you will have today, I am sure if you haven't heard of DAX before, this is a reaction for sure you will have today by at least in the next 15-20 minutes. It is at the basic level, it's straightforward to understand, but as things get just a little bit more complicated, as we take things up from point A to point B, you will want to bang your head on the wall and you will want to think about, I don't want to do this anymore. Forget it. I'm going back to Python. As Sakurai says in the chat window perfectly, DAX is simple, but it is not easy or it is hard to learn. It is simple once you get it. It's when you look at the code, it's simple. But when you actually get down to writing the code, you'll get errors, you'll get some sort of, you'll not get the answers you're looking for, all sorts of bizarre answers. And that will take a lot of practice and a lot of experience for that. All right, so here is a chart I picked up from Google. I tried to find the source, I couldn't find it. But this very well encapsulates why DAX can be hard to master. And there's a very nice X and Y axis. So there's functionality and difficulty here. So these scalar functions, these are functions like sum, divide, and all these functions, distinct, count, and all those functions. These are straightforward. If you've done them in Excel, it's really, you'll handle all of these. And we look at a couple of them today. But then the curve starts to go up, the difficulty curve. Then it comes to calculated columns. Relatively simple to understand once you get the hang of it. But then measures are very confusing. Right, so when you think about, you'll think, okay, measures, calculate columns, that's the same thing. When you look at how they work, you think, what is the difference between them? But as you learn a bit more advanced stuff, you'll start to get the curtain will just start to peel away, and you'll start to understand the difference between them. And as you go a little higher in terms of complexity, it becomes a little bit tougher at each step, until there'll be a moment in your learning curve where everything will suddenly start making sense. All the pieces of the puzzle will come together, and all of what you learn, all of that effort that you put in will all be worth it. I want to emphasize on this a lot, that if at any point in your learning journey, when you're learning DAX, you feel, oh, this is way too tough, right? I'm not getting it. Just know that's a reaction everybody's had. Anybody you see learning Power BI, doing Power BI in the industry, every single person has had that reaction. It is just a matter of practice and patience. That is it. There is no shortcut. I mean, if you were looking for shortcuts, there's quite literally no shortcut. You have to go through that phase just like everybody does when they're learning DAX. Once you pass that, it is everything will make sense and it will be very, very easy after that point. So just be a little patient with yourself, more importantly than anything else, and you will easily be able to master DAX after a certain point. All right, so what are the important points in DAX? And I saw this from somebody in the chat window. Sakurai again, perfect. Context transition, filter context, row context, all of these, absolutely. Without this, nothing will make sense at the end of the day. So before we get into Power BI, before we start, coding up a few formulas and all that, it's important to get a sense of the theory part of it before you get into, coding stuff and looking at different things. So there are a lot of concepts, but if I had to boil it down to two broad terms you should be aware of before learning calculate columns and measures, those are row context and filter context. What this means is very complicated to explain in a 40 minutes or in a 1 hour session. But I will try and walk you through that when we get into Power BI and give you a sense of what these two mean. Just keep these in mind as you go into Power BI. I'll keep referring to them again and again as and when we get there. Take a screenshot of this, if nothing else. This very nicely summarizes what row context is and what filter context is. This query context, don't worry about that right now. That is for far, far ahead in your journey. Just focus on row context and filter context for now. I will explain this when we get into Power BI, but just take a screenshot of this. This will be very, very helpful when you're later looking at the recording and trying to do something. This can come in very handy when you want to keep it as a reference point. I will explain both of them in a second. Now I want to answer this question of calculated columns versus measures. I talked about this, we at least mentioned this about 15 minutes back. So I'll go to the next one. The difference between, there are plenty of differences, but keep 2 points in mind right now. Just keep 2 points in mind. A calculated columns works exactly like you see in Excel, right? You can see a tangible physical column in your table, like sales minus profit, right? You get some value, or sales into quantity, you get the gross sales at the end of it. So you see the column row by row, you get the answer there. That's a calculated column. It's not that difficult to understand. It's a very straightforward column that you can see in the table. Measure, on the other hand, is not something you'll directly be able to see in the table that you have. Measure is not stored in the table. It is just kept as a formula that you created until you call it inside a visualization. Again, this might be a little confusing while you're learning this or while you're just looking at the theory. So we will look at this in Power BI in a second, so that the difference, at least at a basic level, is clear for us. So Alex, what are the important reasons to learn DAX? I can list down a lot of them, but probably the biggest reason is that without DAX, Power BI is it's like you'll know if you can create a report of visualizations, 20 to 30% of Power BI. The remaining 70% is divided between DAX and Power Query. So I'll say, very broadly or roughly, Power Query would probably make about 20-25%, and the remaining 55-60% is all about DAX. As Shikhar says, the heart of Power BI is DAX, the brain is the Power Query. That's a great analogy. Thanks, Shikhar. All right, so what I'll do is I'll get into Power BI. I will walk you through these theoretical concepts there so that we can actually see in a practical sense what in the world is, what in the world do these terms mean. So what I'm doing is I'm just sharing a data set in the chat window if anybody wants to follow along. But my suggestion is it will be more beneficial for you if you just look at my screen for this session, and you can always watch the recording later when you're practicing and doing this. So Naveen, I don't know what you mean by access Power BI in Google. So if you can expand on that question. In the meantime, I will get into let me get into Power BI. Okay, so we'll be working with a Superstore data set. If you've ever used Tableau, you'll be very familiar with this data set. So I'm just going to import that, and I'm going to get this in. So click on Open and give this a second. So Naveen, yes, Power BI Desktop is a free software. You can download it from it's on Windows. It's not there on Mac. So you can download it on the Microsoft Store or just Google Power BI Desktop download. You'll get the official Microsoft link there. So in the Superstore dataset, we have orders, people, and returns. We have three tables. We are only concerned with the orders table. That is the main table, which is all the different levels of information for Superstore. So let's click on this. So Rimjim, if you can keep this question for towards the end of the Q&A, we will definitely look at that. So Alex, there's no Mac version for Power BI. I am on a Mac actually, but I am working on the virtual machine. So there's no, Microsoft has not released any Power BI version for Mac, and they don't plan to release any version for Mac either because, well, Microsoft, Apple. So you can imagine where this is going. So you will have to, yeah, exactly. So you'll have to use a VM. So I am on AWS. If you have something else, you can use that. But without it, you can't spin up anything in Mac. All right. So we'll select the orders table here and click on load. So transform data will take you to Power Query, but that's, I mean, it's a different discussion altogether. So we'll go ahead and click on load. And what load does is it loads the data set into the Power BI desktop window itself. So let's give it a second. There are about 10,000 rows in this orders table. So it might, depending on your RAM, this might take 5 to maybe anywhere between 5 seconds to 60 seconds to load. All right, so AS, again, good question, but keep that towards the end for the Q&A. I'll try and answer that there. All right, so as we imported this file, you can see here on the right-hand side in the fields table, I have the orders table. And if I expand this, I can see all these different columns in the Superstore or the orders table. And here you can see, I mean, it has a lot of information about customers, location, products, subcategories, and sales, profit, a lot of information there. So I've already sent the link in the chat window. You can download that and can explore this later. By the way, this is a great data set to practice Power BI in general, not just DAX. So you can keep this for, creating a dashboard or something like that. All right, so coming back to this, I want to look at the data itself. So on the left-hand side of my Power BI desktop window, I have three tabs. By default, we'll always be on the report tab in Power BI desktop. We have the data tab, which is represented very nicely by a table icon. And we have the model tab, which is where you create relationships between different tables and all that. If you're familiar with SQL, this is where all those joins and all that happens. So I'll come back to this data tab, this second tab here on the left-hand side. And give this a second. This is where you can see your data in a tabular format, just like you can see it in Excel. You can see it here, except I can't change anything, right? If I double click anywhere, which I'm doing right now, I can't really change anything here, right? This is just something that I can view so that I can understand what is the kind of data I'm working with, what are the columns and all those different things here. So I will, sure. So I've just shared it, Naveen, in the chat window. And here we have, as I said, different order level information, location level, product level, customer level, and we have sales, quantity, discount, and profit here at the end. What I'm going to do here is straight away start off by talking about calculated columns. How do I create them? Where are they visible? And where are they useful? Where are they not useful? So to create a calculated column, right now, see, we have sales, quantity, discount, and profit, right? What I want to do is think of sales as your sale price. So what I'll do is I'll just rename this so that it's easier to understand and follow along. To rename anything, I can just double click on this. I'll call this sale price or selling price, whatever you guys prefer. And just double click on the column header and you can rename that. What I want to do is I want a new column here at the end, which is nothing but the product of sale price and quantity. So it should be 77 into 2. Answer here 124. Sorry, 144. 6 into 3, 18, 19. What do we get here? So that is what I want, row by row here in a new column at the end that I can see and look at. So to create a calculated column, there are multiple ways to do it. You'll have to find a way that works best for you. I'll show you a couple of ways here. One is you'll notice here at the top in the ribbon in your Power BI window. So you have something called table tools, right? If you go to table tools, you have in the calculation section, you have something called new column. So Mukul, hang on to that question. I can talk about that question for a long time. So just hang on to that. Just ask me that question in the Q&A. We'll have 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So just hang on to that question till then. So we'll click on new column here. That is one option. What I recommend doing, and this is by no means a rule or anything, you can click on new column and work with that, not a problem. What I recommend doing is here on the right hand side, you will have the whatever tables you've imported. Obviously, we've only imported one table, orders. You can have multiple tables. And often when you're sitting in interviews, you're given an assignment, when you're working in the industry, you will always have multiple tables that you're working with because different kinds of information is always available in different tables. You'll have a customer table, a product table, a geolocation table, different sorts of tables there, order level information table. So you'll have a lot of different tables there. What will help us is if I know which table I want that column in, I can right click on that table name. Since we only have orders, it's not really a problem. So I'll right click on the orders table. I'll right click on this, and here I'll select the second option from the top, which is called new column. So we'll select new column and give this a second. And as soon as you do that, you will notice a formula bar comes in. So let me just expand this a little bit. A formula bar comes in just like you see a formula bar in Excel, where you can type in exactly what you want in that column that you're creating. In our case, we want, let's say, the total sales, which is nothing but a product of sale price into quantity. So here what we'll do is we'll say total sales is equal to, and here what? Sale price into quantity, right? So just type in sale price and you will get a drop down from Power BI that, okay, are you looking for this column? And we are. So you can either click on this, press enter, press tab, all of these will work. Into asterisk into quantity. So quantity, type in quantity, you'll get the drop down again, orders quantity. Select that and press enter. Select that and press enter. And here you'll notice here, as soon as I press enter on the right hand side in my orders table, I have a new column or a new entry at least called total sales, which has a tabular icon next to it. And in my actual table, you can see a new column has come in called total sales, which is nothing but this sale price into quantity for each row. Right, row by row, it's giving you the answer for each. So this works exactly like it does in Excel. Now here is where the row context comes in, right? I was talking about row context earlier. If I just go back to this, row context means nothing but row by row calculation. That's it. Row context means it is going row by row. It's doing this into this, then again this into this, then again this into this, then again this. It's going row by row and it's giving you the answer row by row. That is what is called as row context. Calculated columns by default have row context. So you don't have to worry about anything here. It's just giving you a very simple formula and you got the answer here. So why is this row context important? Should you even care about that? You should, because when it comes to measures, which we'll talk about right now, and this is where you'll start tearing your hair out, measures do not have row context by default. What do I mean by that? Let me show you an example. So you understood this calculate columns, right? Straightforward stuff here. Let's create a measure, which again is nothing but a product of sale price and quantity. I want to do the exact same thing, but not in a calculate column, in a measure. Let's see that in a second. All right, so here, same thing, same logic. I can either go to table tools, instead of new column, I can click on new measure, or I'll just right click on the table name. And I can just select the first option, which is called new measure. Let's do that. And again, a new formula bar will come in based on what you typed in. I'll again call this total sales. I'll call this measure because otherwise we'll get an error. This name already exists. So total sales measure is equal to, now if I try the same formula. Prasad, it's nothing. Just press Control and the plus arrow, plus key on your keyboard. Just keep pressing that. It'll keep zooming in. So total sales measure equal to, now let's try the same formula. So this will be sale price. Now when I type this in, notice there's nothing in the drop down that comes in. And there's nothing that comes in here. And DAX intelligence or Power BI intelligence is smart enough to understand where you're going wrong. If you don't get a drop down, it means you're going wrong somewhere. Otherwise, you will always get a drop down in the list of options of what you can select from that. If you don't get it, keep in mind this is somewhere you're going wrong, and DAX is telling you, Power BI is telling you that, boss, take a step back, understand what it is that you're doing wrong. So let me remove this and let me still try and force feed that into play. So our total sales is what? Let me try and get the same formula here. Still nothing, but that's fine. Into orders and quantity, right? I still don't get any drop down. And you'll notice here, one, there is a red strip that's come on the right hand side, which is telling me there's something wrong. And I say, okay, fine. I still don't care. I'm still going to go ahead and press enter. I still want to see what happens if I do this. So let's press enter. And here we go. Two problems. One is you can see an underline here, which says cannot find name sale price. Right? There's no sale price, which we know is not true, right? We know I can literally see sale price here. So what do you mean there's no sale price? And then there's a very small error here at the bottom, which tells you a single value for column sale price cannot be determined. This tooltip error is not very helpful from a beginner perspective because it's very difficult to make sense of what is happening here. What it's telling you is that because measures don't have row context, they don't know how to work with this. Let me explain that in a slightly more simpler way. What is happening, what a measure does is it looks at an aggregation. Exactly, Rajat. So it looks at an aggregation, not a row by row calculation. So unlike a calculate column, which did a row by row calculation, gave you answer row by row, or as we saw here, a measure does not know what you mean by row right now. So when you say order sale price in a measure, it has no idea which row it wants to look at. It only understands an aggregation, as in sum of sale price and sum of quantity. So that one value, measure will only give you one value, which is a product of something or a sum of something. That is it. It does not understand row by row calculation by default. So what we have to do is to circumvent or to get out of this error that we're getting, we will have to tell this measure how to get row context. And that is where functions like sumx, countx, averagex, all these iterator functions come in. If this is overwhelming right now, just know that that's perfectly okay. When you watch this recording later, then you do it yourself, this will make a little bit more sense when you run into your own errors. And the more you run into errors, the more clear it will be what in the world Pranav is talking about right now. So let me show you right now, how do I, get out of this error that we're stuck in and tell this measure how to get row context. So Raj, I'll just answer that question in a second. That's a great question. I will just answer that in a second. So here, inside this formula, what I'll say is total sales measure is equal to, we'll use this function called sumx, which stands for sum expression. X stands for expression. So sumx, and you can see here in sumx, there are two parameters that are required. First is the table name, which in our case is the orders table, right? We are telling it, okay, go in the orders table. You have to specify the name of the table first. Go in the orders table. And the second is the expression. This is where the formula comes in now. So this will be sale price. And now you'll see that the tooltip has come back in because it is inside the function. Without the function, it simply doesn't work. Right? So sale price into quantity. And that was the same formula we used for the calculate column. We're just putting that inside sumx here. And what sumx does is it now is adding a row context to the measure. So if I press enter now, that error will hopefully go away. And now I will have a measure here called total sales measure, which, by the way, you cannot see in the table itself. Unlike this total sales calculate column, total sales measure is not a tangible column that you can see in the data table itself. A measure is just a formula that is sitting in your orders table until you call it inside a visualization, which we'll do in a second. So coming to the question that I'm seeing in the chat window of why should I do measures when calculate columns exist? There are a couple of big reasons for that. One is, as Akshit says in the chat window, calculated columns, you can see here, right? This is a tangible column. This has been added to my table. So by default, it is taking up space on my machine. It's taking space in my window. And right now you might think, yeah, why should I care? There are 10,000 rows. What is, and about 20, 21 columns. What is one more column here? And I would agree with you. This is a relatively small data set, but I want you to think about it from an industry perspective. When an interviewer asks you, what is the would you choose a calculate column or a measure to answer this and this question, right? What they are looking for is an explanation of your thought process of why would you choose one over the other. A calculated column takes up memory, and when you have a lot of rows, like a million rows, a billion rows, which is quite often the case these days with the amount of data that you will find in client locations or whatever you're working for. If you keep adding more calculated columns, your data model becomes bigger and bigger, and that takes more and more space. Not every company is Facebook and Google and Amazon and Uber that they can afford a lot of computational resources. A lot of the times you will have constraints on your RAM, on your resources. You want to keep it as optimized as possible, which is not what calculated columns do. What measures do, I think somebody mentioned this in the chat window, is they are just sitting here like a formula. They're not taking any space. It's just a formula here until, if I go back to my report view, until I create something like, let me just create a very simple bar chart here. Until I create this bar chart and put this total sales measure inside this bar chart, this is not taking up any space. It is just sitting here like a formula. If this is still confusing, keep in mind 95, in fact, I'm underselling it. 97 to 98% of the times in the industry and in interviews, when you're given assignments, you will be creating measures. There are very, very few use cases where you will use calculate columns. In fact, in the previous 3-4 projects that I have done, I have not used calculate columns at all. We end up using measures because they do the work of calculate columns without adding to the space that our data model takes. So if the theory is confusing, I'll share a couple of resources before we end the webinar. There you can learn a bit more about calculate columns, a bit more about measures, but just keep this important point in mind that if ever you are conflicted between using one or the other, go for measures by default. There is no question of choosing calculate columns over measures unless your client tells you, no, Pranav, I don't care. Use calculate columns. I don't care. I want to see it in the table. You don't have a choice then. But if you do have a choice, if your client is not really that rude or stuck up, then you should use measures over calculate columns pretty much all the time. So Ricardo, exactly. Measures don't add anything. I mean, that's a stretch, but they don't take any space until you call them inside any visual or anything. Just sitting here like a formula. So Ankan, it can return string values as well, right? You can create something like if the order quantity is less than 10, it should show as a light or should show as a small order. So small order inverted comma, that's a string. You can always return a string there as well. All right, so let me actually show you this. So in this bar chart, I will get, let's say, subcategory and this total sales measure. Right now, I have called this total. Let me just get the filters out of the way. So now that I've called this total sales measure here, you can see now chairs, phones, tables, blah, 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 so on and so forth. So all of these subcategories have this much, whatever sales they've done for the superstore company. Until I call this inside this visual, total sales measure is just sitting here, not taking up any space. It's just, if you want to use it, use it. If you don't, you're not adding anything to your window. And keep in mind that Power BI is very resource intensive. On an 8 GB laptop, the more calculate columns you add, the more two problems. One, every time you open that Power BI file, it will take more and more time to open. Two, every time you create another calculate column, it will take even more time to process. And I'm talking literally minutes here, not seconds, minutes. So if you have like, let's say 1.3 million rows, right? That's if you have dabbled into data science or machine learning. It is, think of the New York City taxi or limousine data set, very common example. Every month, each month has about 1.3 million rows. That's more than what Excel can handle, by the way. So when you get that into Power BI and you decide, okay, I'll create 10 more columns. I want to do feature engineering. I want to create 10 more columns here. You create them on an 8 GB laptop. You open that again. It'll take 2 to 3 minutes to open. You create another calculate column. It'll take 5 minutes to open. You create another one. It'll take 10 minutes to open. So the more you add, the slower it becomes for you itself, plus for the company that you're working with or for. So just keep in mind, just by default, go for measures over calculate column. Just keep that very important point in mind. So here, how can I get a bar chart? So in this case, see, bar chart is here. In the visualizations pane, you have all these different visuals. What I did was it's my go-to chart, the clustered bar chart. Just click on this bar chart and just select subcategory and total sales from your fields measure. You can get that, you can get it to show here. I can do the same thing. You'll get the same answer if I, instead of this total sales measure, if I remove this and I show total sales, I get the same answer. But now that you guys know the difference between the two, it is by default a good idea to use a measure instead of a calculate column. There are other advantages as well, which is not something I'm getting into right now, but it is by default something you should attune your mindset to, that I am going to create a measure for this particular problem and then work with that. All right, so I'll move on here. I think we have about 10-15 more minutes. I want to show you a couple of other examples of how useful measures can be when you're answering interview questions, when you're answering business questions. So let me show you another example. I'll just keep this aside. What I want to show you next is, so Akshay, good question. Again, keep that for the Q&A. I'll try and answer that as much as I can there. So another example I want to show you is the most, I'm not exaggerating, it is the most important function in DAX, and that is the calculate function. If you take anything away from this webinar, make sure it's the calculate function. It is the most common function that is there, is the function you'll be using more and more when you learn Power BI. But it is something you will have to learn very well if you see yourself using Power BI as a tool in the future, or even in an interview or in the industry. So what is the calculate function? Let me show you an example. So let's create a measure. Let's right click on the orders table and let's go to new measure. Exactly, Akshat. So calculate and filter use 90. That has been my experience as well. I think, let me just expand this a bit. Calculate is something that, because it's such a flexible and powerful function, that is something that by default, any analyst, any data scientist will gravitate towards the calculate function because of how much you can accomplish and how many questions you can answer using this calculate function. Let me show you a couple of examples of what calculate can do, and you can experiment with that when you are doing this on your own after watching the recording and all that. So let's create a very simple one. Let's say I only want to look at the sale number or sale numbers of phones that have been sold by Superstore. Only the phones, that's what I want to look at. So here what I can do is, I'll just call this phone sales equal to, I'll go to the next line, Control Enter goes to the next line. Okay, the Mac keyboard does not agree with me, so it's Alt Enter. So I'll go to the next line, phone sales equal to calculate function. Just type in calculate, you'll get the drop down. Calculate function, as it says, it evaluates an expression in a context modified by filters. I'm telling you, Microsoft has done a very poor job of creating these tooltips for beginners. For people who are using it, you don't really need to use tooltips. For people who are new to it, who need tooltips, Microsoft has not really done a great job explaining it. So let's see what this does. So calculate, bracket open. The first, I'll go to the next line. The first parameter that is required is the expression. What do you want to calculate? In our case, I already have the total sales measure. So here I'll say total sales measure. total sales measure, comma, go to the next line. Total sales measure, go to the next line. And here you can add in the filter. So in our case, I want only the sales for the phones subcategory. So here I will say subcategory. Just type in subcategory, you will get the drop down again. So subcategory is equal to inverted commas phones. I am applying a filter inside the function itself. So anytime I call this in a visual, in a table, in a report, in a dashboard, it will always have the phones filter attached to it. So any other subcategory will not be shown here. Let me show you what the output of this is, so it will be a little clearer there. So let's press enter. Let's press enter. Suraj, you can use if, absolutely, if exists, but I actively tell people not to use if in Power BI because the more you use if, the more confusing it becomes, especially nested if conditions. It becomes more and more confusing. You can use something like a switch statement if you're familiar with that, but calculate is something, even if you feel uncomfortable using it right now, and I certainly did for the first 2 months when I was learning it, it is something you will have to get used to if you want to learn DAX. Because without calculate, like Akshit said, about 80-90% of your analysis will be predicated on knowing the calculate function. So it's something you should become familiar with. So let me just close this. Let me get rid of this and let's bring a matrix into. So matrix is the third icon in the fifth row in my visualizations pane. So I'll get the matrix in here. Matrix is nothing but a table, not an interactive, but a pivot table like table format. So here, let me get the matrix in and let us look at subcategories. And let's look at total sales measure. And finally, let's look at phone sales. Okay, very interesting answer. So subcategories, we have about 17 subcategories here. We have the total sales of each subcategory. And then this function that we just created, this calculate function where we said only show me the sales number for this phone subcategory, right? And we can see here that the phone subcategory, let me just arrange this in descending order. We can see the phone subcategory is about $1.6 million. And the phone sales column here, it's $1.6 million across the board, right? Because we told Power BI that just show me the value for the phone subcategory. And you can see that across the board here. Now, if you want to, if you feel and this is not something I want, I only want where there is a match with phones, I want to show that value here. Everywhere else, I want to keep it as blank. And you want to, if it's not matching, I want to keep it as blank. So it's a very simple function you have to use. So I'll go back to our phone sales. Go back to your formula phone sales, and where it says order subcategory is equal to phones, all you have to do is use a function called keep filters. What this does is it overrides the filter and it will only show you the value where there is a matching value there. So if I press on enter, where there is no match, so phones and phone sales has a match, so you get the value here. Where there is no match, like chairs and phone sales, there's no match, blank. Tables, phone, there's no match, there's no overlap, blank. So that is how you can create a very quick measure using the calculate function and try and answer these kind of questions using keep filters, whatever reports you're creating. If you instead of a table, if you're creating a bar chart, a line chart, anything of the sort, you can extract a subset of your data like phone subcategory. If you're analyzing only a certain region like north, south, or a certain product, like I'm only analyzing iPhone sales or OnePlus sales or Samsung sales, anything of the sort, you can extract that, put that into a measure and only analyze that kind of measure there to look at those different things. All right, so I just use one more example. And then we can wrap. I want to show you a couple of resources where you can learn DAX a lot more from scratch from a beginner perspective, because this webinar is more about giving you a sense of what DAX can accomplish, because even I would say 40 hours is not enough to learn DAX. You need at least 100 hours of practice to truly understand how DAX works. So Nitish, sure, this is the formula that we used. All right, so how do we download the report? Which report do you mean? I mean, it's there on your machine. So what do you need to download? I'm not sure what that question was. So Shikhar, I would say even 3 hours is not enough. 3 hours is enough to get an idea of what row context and filter context, what are the differences between them. But to truly master it, it will take a lot of time. For me personally, it took about 6 months to master it. And there was a lot of, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't, I'm done. I'm going back to Python. Forget DAX. I don't want to do this anymore. But I came back to it because I didn't really have a choice. I needed it for my job. But it is something that you will have to be a little patient with yourself for. So Sajid, the difference between table and matrix: table is static, it's very straightforward. Matrix, so think of it this way: if you use pivot tables in Excel, matrix works like a pivot table. A normal table in Power BI is just a very static table. So usually when you'll see most of the examples online on YouTube or anywhere else, you'll see 99% of these experts are using matrix instead of a static table. Just get used to this matrix concept quickly. All right, so guys, one more example I wanted to show you. I will just put this here on the top left. So Hassan, is matrix like a heat map in Python? Something like that. Something like that. You're thinking in the right direction. It is read something like that. You're right. Shikhar, filter context, right? Just give me a second. Just give me a second. So I'll draw up another table. So this time, instead of a matrix, I'll use a table. So you can see the difference between them. So I will draw up a table here. The table, by the way, is just to the left of this matrix. So here I will put the order date. I'll remove day from here. I'll put order date. We'll put the total sales measure. Right, so we can see here year, quarter, and month, and what was the total sales for that particular month in that quarter in that year. Now, what I want to do here is I want a new column here which shows me the target sales. I want to basically see, am I achieving the target that was set or not? So to do that, again, our good old friend measure is very helpful in that sense. So I'll right click on orders and click on new measure. Click on new measure, and here I'll just call this target sales. Target sales equal to, go to the next line, and we'll use calculate again. Calculate what? Calculate the total sales. You can see the total sales measure here, comma. Let me get rid of this tooltip. Calculate the total sales for what? What we are saying here is our target is nothing but adding 10% to the previous month's sales. Right. So take January. For February, the target will be January sales into 10%. For March, the target will be February sales into 10%. Obviously, the industry has much better ways of defining a target for each month and each quarter. But to understand how this works, we're using this very crude example. We're saying total sales, and in calculate, what we can do here is, as Akshit said, we can use that, or I will show you another function that is very DAX specific, and that is called as same period last year. Actually, even better than that, you can check out same period last year later. I will use something called previous month, not previous day, but previous month. We will say previous month here. And in previous one, we'll just point it to our order date column and close the bracket. And just remember, I am taking the previous month and adding 10% to that, right? So apart from this, I'll go to the next line. I'll just say into 1.1, which is nothing but adding 10% to it, and bracket close. So we are closing the calculate function. So what am I doing here? I'll just walk you through this again. Take the total sales of the previous month and add 10% to it, right? That's the logic. That's it, nothing else. So what are we calculating? We're calculating the total sales for the previous month, and we are adding 10% to that. That's how we can read this. Press enter. And I've probably done something wrong here. And okay, let me quickly look at this. I think I've probably used, oh yeah, this is not where it was supposed to be. Okay, anyway, date is not required. Let's get rid of this. I think I mean, I think I'm making some very silly mistake here. But basically, what is happening here is what we're telling Power BI is take this, add 10% to that, and show it in front of this. So there are functions like previous month, quarter to date, QTD, MTD, YTD for year to date calculations, same period last year. So there are a lot of date functions that you will find yourself using a lot inside the calculate function, which are very helpful in that sense. I'll check out why this is not. I'm fairly certain I'm doing a very simple or silly syntax error there. I'll check that out. I'll share this file along with the recording and ask the team to share that with you. So you're saying two brackets are closed, but I only opened one. Oh yeah, I mean that is a classic Pranav mistake. You're right. Good catch. So end calculate here. We don't need it here. Right, perfect. Thank you for pointing that out. There we go. Perfect. Excellent catch. Let me get target sales in here. And this does need the date. And hopefully that will work. It works. Perfect. So you can see here 73 into 10% gives you 81. 19 to 10% gives you 21. And what you can do is you can now look at something like I'll just show you this here. I'll just put it over top of this. And now I can do a very simple subtraction of these two. I can go to orders. I can go to new measure. And I can say sales variance or sales difference is nothing but your total sales minus your target sales, and press enter. And I can get this sales variance into play as well. And there we go. I can see that for each month in my data set, how much did I achieve in terms of the target? If you see a positive value, it means I exceeded the target. If you see a negative value, it means I fell short of the target. And you can convert this into a waterfall chart. So if I go ahead and find a waterfall chart, you can look at these kind of things in a waterfall chart here. I can put an order date somewhere here. I can look at sales variance, and you can see here, if I drill down, that this is how, if you see a red value, it means you failed to meet the target. If you see a green value, it means you exceeded the target that was set. So this is how you have to combine your table with a visualization to convince your audience, your interviewer, your hiring manager, your client, your stakeholder that this is why we are here. These are the kind of questions we can answer and take it forward from that. All right. Okay, so just look at the Q&A questions, guys. So Sasidhar is asking difference between new measure and quick measure. So Sasidhar, my suggestion is don't go for, when you're learning measures, just forget about quick measure. Quick measure has things like running total, year-to-date calculations, some things like that, but it's not something you should worry about when you're learning this. In fact, I cannot even remember the last time I used quick measure in the industry for a project. So it's just something that those are some very popular functions that you end up using. Those are already pre-built in those quick measures. But my suggestion is forget quick measures for now. Just focus on creating measures from scratch. Just keep that when you're practicing. Let me see. Tableau and Power BI. I saw this question a few times, and I'm not surprised. I see that question a lot. So which one should you prefer? Which one should you use? So here's a personal experience. I started learning Tableau in 2014. In fact, for 4-5 years of my career, I learned Tableau, I used Tableau, and when Power BI came out in 2016, I thought, meh, I don't like Power BI. I don't care about Power BI. I don't want to use it. And till 2019, I held firm. I held my ground that no, I don't care about Power BI. I want Tableau. Tableau is the best. But in the last 3-4 years, I have grown to love Power BI quite a lot because of how flexible it is, how easy it is, how huge the community is. But to answer your, see, there are no right or wrong answers there. It depends on what role you're applying for. Different projects, different companies, organizations use Tableau, use Power BI. If you're starting from scratch, if you're not associated with a project or a company, my suggestion is just by default learn Power BI. It's not even a question anymore, because in the last 3 years, there has been a huge shift in the industry towards learning and using Power BI due to multiple reasons. And a lot of companies, especially companies who are setting up their business intelligence analytics functions and departments, are adopting Power BI over Tableau. I'm not saying Tableau is useless. Tableau is used by a lot of companies even now. But if you're starting from scratch, Power BI is probably something that you will find a broader market for rather than Tableau. There are a lot of other reasons as well. Tableau is $70 a month. Power BI is free. The Pro license is $10 a month. So you can probably draw your own conclusions from that. But there are other reasons as well. All right, let me pick up a few other questions. Where to get exercises for practice? Great question. So there is this website called Monday Makeover. And let me find this. Just Google Monday Makeover data sets. So they have about 500, 600 data sets. Pick a problem. These data sets are have been created and curated from a visualization perspective. So you can pick up anything that that is a problem statement that you find interesting. Like I said, I love sports, so I keep scrolling through here to find any sports data sets. But you can try and find anything that interests you and work with that in Power BI or whatever tools it is that you're using. Okay. What DAX function should we focus more on for attending interviews? So from an interview perspective, I mean, nobody will expect you to memorize functions except the calculate function. That is something. So from an interview perspective, I'll tell you. From an interview DAX perspective, or actually, I'll take a step back. From an interview perspective for Power BI, you need four things, sorry. One, you need to obviously know how to create a dashboard in Power BI. That's the most basic stuff. Two, from a DAX perspective, you need to learn what is row context, what is filter context, how to use the calculate function. That is the most basic. You can go into things like distinct count, sum x. We saw a couple examples here, but nobody will expect you to memorize those things. They will, however, expect you to know what is row context, filter context, and calculate. There is no going there without it. Three, you'll need to know Power Query. That is the inbuilt tool to pre-process your data in Power BI. It's also there in Excel. So you need to learn that. And four, you will need to understand where can I apply Power BI. Technical knowledge is great. It's great that you know Power BI, but how are you helping the business answer questions using Power BI is also something that the interviewer will look for. And that's something, at least at a basic level, you should know how to answer those questions. Okay, I'll pick up a couple of more questions, guys. I know we are way over time. But when writing DAX, how do you visualize the flow of the code and context like you do while writing code? So this comes a lot from experience. Sorry, I don't see your name. I just see anonymous attendee there. But it's a great question. So a lot of this comes from experience. So usually what happens is I write the base code and then I go outside of it. For example, in this example that we just saw, the calculate function, where we looked at the previous month, we calculated target sales. What I usually do, unlike what I did here, is when I'm doing it for the first time, I will try and look at it. I'll try and do the previous month first, then go out and put in the calculate function. And if it's a longer query, I put in the whatever I want inside the core, I put in first, and then go outside of that to the top, to the whatever function, sum x, calculate, whatever it is I'm using. But that's a very personal thing. You will have to find your own thing, there is unfortunately no other answer to it than just practice and experience will help you, create that kind of mindset. Okay, one more question. To become data engineer, is it important to learn Power BI? No, not really. Data engineer is a different ball game altogether. For that, you'll need to learn a lot of things about Spark, data pipelines, machine learning pipelines, all that. Power BI is probably something that you don't necessarily need to worry about for a data engineer. All right, so let me see if. Oh, I like this question. When I started Python, after that I started Power BI and back to Python, I forgot most things. What is the best way to learn two things simultaneously? This is a problem I faced a lot when I was learning. I was new to this field about 10 years back. So to be honest with you, conducting it parallelly is learning it parallelly is not something I encourage anybody to do. That's you're kind of setting yourself up for a lot of problems in the future. So don't try not to do that. But if you feel no, I want to learn both at the same time, my only suggestion to that is probably keep a certain in a week, keep a certain like 3 days continuously learn Power BI, 4 days continuously learn Python. If you do it alternately, if you think I'll do 1 hour Python, 1 hour Power BI, you will not remember any of those things. That's not how our minds are wired. Our minds don't take in information that way. So it's just going to be very, very confusing in that sense. So that is probably the best advice I can offer to that question. Okay. All right. So anybody, if you have any questions later on, I think somebody shared my profile in the chat window, or just, go to LinkedIn, search for Pranav there. There are only 2 Pranav thers on LinkedIn. You'll understand which one I am. And add me if you have any questions there. I am more than happy to connect there. I might take some time to get back to you because I get a lot of messages during the day. But I will reply back to you for sure. Thanks, Ketak, for sharing the link in the chat window. All right, so I'm sorry, guys, if I didn't answer your question. We had a lot of questions there, but I think most of the questions, a lot of things. Hopefully, you guys got a sense of where DAX is useful. Practice it as much as you can. If you do anything, like if you're putting any dashboard online, anything, tag me on your LinkedIn post. I'm more than happy to offer my 2 cents of feedback if you want anything there, and I am more than happy to share.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Perfect. So thanks everyone. Have a very nice day, and great questions. Keep the curiosity going. Rishabh, back to you.
Yeah, sure. So thanks a lot, Pranav. On behalf of Analytics Vidhya, I would like to thank you for your time and delivering such a wonderful session.